But enough talk! How about you?
Today's video is going to be about the humble Metroidvania, or more specifically, the terminology of the subgenre. But before we get there, I need to talk about Terminator Resistance. I've already done videos, I've done tweets, I've talked about this for a while. It's a Terminator game that came out at the end of last year and is surprisingly really quite good. It's like Fallout Light, FPS light, RPG action light. Like, light is the operative word, but with the budget they had, which wasn't much. And these were the people what did the Rambo game, I should point out. They did the best Terminator they could with the budget they had, and it shows, and they actually gave a crap about the property, about the source material, and that's what happens. You don't need a lot of money, you just need people that care about the material, and that's how a good licensed game happens. Terminator Resistance tries so hard. It's got romance options in multiple endings, right? A whole crafting system, a leveling system, a relationship system, multiple endings with slides, a bit like Fallout, like the endings of the newer ones, right? Did I mention, I know I did, but we need to come back to the romance options. There are romance options in this game with sex scenes, it's amazing, and also tastefully done ones. They are tastefully done, you don't see nothing. Metroidvania. When I say that word, you know what I mean. A portmanteau of Metroid and Castlevania, it's become the catch-all subgenre term for action-adventure games of a particular design seen most famously in Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Metroidvanias are defined in general by their map layouts, which tend to be interconnected, with areas gated off by obstacles that can't be overcome until the player has more abilities or equipment that let them navigate whatever hindrance was in place, often taking the form of side-scrolling platform-based games, though not necessarily. Metroidvanias are noted for their encouragement of exploration, a closer connection between story and gameplay, and RPG elements including leveling systems and a variety of weapons and gear to unlock and equip. Also, some people really hate the term Metroidvania. Criticism of the word has been around for quite a while, but saw renewed vigour thanks to the popularity of Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Directed by Koji Igarashi, Bloodstained was the game that Konami didn't want to make. With his years of experience working on the Castlevania series, including Symphony of the Night, there are few people as qualified to make a top-quality Metroidvania, which is what Iga and his studio Artplay did. Konami at the time wasn't interested in another proper Castlevania game because Konami isn't interested in much outside of slot machines. So the director led a campaign to make a game that was literally just Castlevania with the serial numbers filed off, and the result was an excellent game. At the time of the Kickstarter's announcement, Koji Igarashi attempted to rebrand the subgenre, naming it Igavania in an attempt to remove the name of the game he hadn't worked on. It also looked like he was taking sole credit for the entire thing, which... come on mate, don't do that. Anyway, it didn't catch on, thank God, and games released over the past few years, great titles such as Axiom Verge, Blasphemous and Hollow Knight, have all partially or fully worn the Metroidvania mantle. And like I said, some people really hate it. Let's talk about one of my least favourite words in the video game lexicon, Metroidvania. writes Joshua Roberts of Kotaku. A portmanteau combining the video game titles Metroid and Castlevania, it takes two made-up video game titles that are pretty cool and evocative on their own, and inelegantly mashes them into something worse. And now that word is one we use to talk about a whole genre of incredible video games. In this Kotaku article, Stop Calling Games Metroidvania, Roberts lays out the argument that it's an unwieldy and unpleasant term, one that makes the language of video games more alienating and difficult than it needs to be. Aesthetically, it's miserable and inefficient, 5 syllables in the mouth and rakish in the ear. Worse, it is completely meaningless to anyone unfamiliar with either of its root words. Words which are also portmanteaus. Metroid, the story goes, is a combination of the word metro and android. Castlevania, meanwhile, is a merging of the words castle and Transylvania into something that actually worked out pretty well. Whether you like the word or not, Roberts makes some very valid arguments in his mission to abolish it. His biggest bugbear is how undescriptive the term is, especially to those less familiar with Metroid and Castlevania, and what those games do to define the subgenre. He posits that other genres are far more immediately descriptive, pointing out how first-person shooter or turn-based strategy do what they say on the tin. They're straightforward labels that let even somebody with zero video game experience get a general grasp of the topic. Video games need to be easier to pass, not harder, Roberts concluded. We talk a lot about diversity and inclusion in games, how we could become a better, more welcoming space if we just figured out a way to represent more perspectives, both in the games we play and in the studios that make them. These are necessary, urgent steps. But I also wonder how many people have never bothered because we've spent all this time using the wrong words. Roberts is not alone. An article titled Metroidvania, It's Time We Give the Genre a Proper Name by Esteban Cuevas, don't you dare let me down pronouncename.com, lays out some similar issues as Roberts, stating, "It doesn't matter that it has been used up to this point without issue. It's a name that only works if you are in the know with video games. Again, if you know what Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night is, then you know what type of game is being talked about. However, if not, then you won't." So is it true? Is it wrong to use a Metroidvania? Is it insufficient as a descriptor? Does it shun people not in the know? Is it holding back diversity because we're using the wrong words? Metroidvania as a term came about in the early 2000s, commonly attributed to Scott Sharkey and Jeremy Parish of 1UP. With almost 2 decades of use, the term has apparently been descriptive enough for most people that it's stuck. Of course, just because something works for most people doesn't mean it shouldn't change. For most, a building without wheelchair access works. That doesn't mean we shouldn't build ramps. Accessibility is important in all walks of life, but the question persists, is Metroidvania as a word actually a problem? A genuine accessibility issue that needs to be addressed? I don't entirely think so. A Metroidvania is something of a deep cut for people invested in playing games. Anyone else could look at Bloodstained, call it a platformer or an action game, and I don't think there'd be an issue with that. Subgenres tend to rely a little on experience to truly make them evocative by their very nature. They are subgenres. They are deeper than broader, all-encompassing labels. But it's worth mentioning those labels still apply. Bloodstained or Castlevania or Blasphemous isn't indescribable to the layperson. And when you're at the point where you're divvying up genres, you probably know enough to not need an obvious self-explanatory term. I'm sure most of you have a basic idea of what jazz is, with its blue notes and swing style and improvisational nature, but then there's acid jazz, cape jazz, new jazz, frevo, post-bop, third stream, and way more. None of which I, as an uncultured novice dumbass, know much about. Most of my jazz knowledge comes from the fucking mighty boosh. The thing is, someone could play me a couple songs from each of these subgenres and I'd get a feel for the sounds that differentiate them. Play me some third stream and I'll note how it blends both jazz and classical music. Play me new jazz and I'll note the influence of funk, soul, dance, and free improv. Thanks, Wikipedia. Likewise, show somebody a combination of Metroid, Axiom Verge, Bloodstained, or Blasphemous, any two games, and they can see the interconnected maps and platforming action that marks the genre. If you've never seen or heard of Metroid or Castlevania, you might need the term explained to you, but as I said, if you're deep enough into a medium to start looking at subgenre, you're likely not such a newcomer that you've never heard of those games. As Esteban Cuevas notes, this has not been an issue until now. In fact, the only people who have pointed out that there's a problem with Metroidvania as a term are people who already know what it means. If you're invested in video games, you know what a Metroidvania is. You've either played Metroid or Castlevania, or you've played one of the many Metroidvanias that have cropped up in the past 2 decades. Once you've played or even seen one such game, the terminology ceases to become a problem. I was never a Metroid fan, so the first Metroidvania I played was Symphony of the Night. I'd actually heard the term Metroidvania not long after, and immediately knew what it meant based on my experience with one game. Just as someone could play me new jazz if I asked what it was, anyone can be shown a Metroidvania, especially via the magic of YouTube, and know what its defining traits are. Or, you know, you could just tell them. It's not that hard to explain what a Metroidvania is. Some argue that shouldn't be necessary, that the title should be self-descriptive, but that's not always possible, especially when you want to be extra descriptive. As I've noted, subgenres are more intricately and exclusively defined, their terms contrived specifically to avoid broad, undetailed terms. For example, Esteban argues that a better term for Metroidvania already exists: platform adventure. On the surface, it looks like a good alternative, it sounds far more elegant than Metroidvania, and it does do a decent job of describing it. Unfortunately, it does a good job of describing so many other types of games as well. Platform games refer to all sorts of titles, pretty much anything involving climbing and jumping to navigate a world. This is a basic element to most Metroidvanias, though it's a basic element to thousands of platform games that don't share the subgenre's unique traits. But that's fine, we modify that with the term adventure. Problem is, adventure itself is a fucking mess of a genre, used to refer to games as diverse as The Legend of Zelda, What Became of Edith Finch, and Bloody Zork. The defining traits of an adventure game are a controlled protagonist and an interactive story involving exploration and solving puzzles, which applies to not just adventure games but many platform games as well, not necessarily Metroidvania ones. Platform adventure is such a massively encompassing term that does absolutely nothing to differentiate Metroidvanias from thousands of other platformers, adventure games, and platform adventures. It's almost like trying to come up with a term that is both broad and definitive for a subgenre is really fucking hard, which might be why so many critics of the term Metroidvania rarely offer alternatives. Now, it's not like Metroidvania is alone as a term reliant on passing knowledge. How many of you have actually played Rogue? How many of you know what a roguelike is? If you've played The Binding of Isaac, Rogue Legacy, or Nuclear Throne, you got a good idea. And I would in fact be curious to know if some of the younger players out there even know that roguelike is named after Rogue. That happens to terms over time. They have distinct meanings, etymology, references, backgrounds that get lost over time because our collective consciousness absorbs those words, and future generations just know what those mean. That's how words work. Yes, we might need certain terms explained to us, but again, that's how words work. Sometimes you hear a term, you don't know what it means, you ask what it means, and you get told what it means. It only becomes a true accessibility issue at that point if the person you ask rolls their eyes, acts like an elitist gatekeeper, and doesn't tell you. Anyway, none of this bit was in the script, so I'm gonna go back to what the hell Craig, what the hell were we talking about? Roguelikes? What does that even mean? Typified generally by randomized dungeon crawls, played in sequential runs where death is permanent and requires restarting with a unique experience each time. Procedural generation is a crucial aspect of such titles. Roguelike elements have been applied to tons of other genres, from hack and slash games to shooters to platformers, to the point where roguelite has become a subterm within a subterm to describe those games that draw elements from but are not necessarily true roguelike games. In any case, These titles owe both their ideas and the name of their subgenre to one game, 1980s Rogue, which defined the rules for those games that followed. I read that in a book once. Not Wikipedia this time, I read all that in a book. It too has seen criticism from some pundits. In a 2013 Gama Sutra article, Tanya X Short declared never say roguelike and made some very familiar arguments, especially when it comes to the usefulness of the term as a descriptor to all but the experienced. For the most part, however, roguelike has stuck around with far less argument and has become pretty much the valid descriptor for a wide variety of games with particular randomized and procedurally generated elements. When a term's been around long enough, there's a degree of cultural osmosis where most people have a good idea of what it means. Basically, once a term's been around long enough, it just becomes part of the natural language. So I don't think we're going to see the term roguelike go anywhere. Ever, probably. Critics often point out the retirement of similar subgenre terms in the past, setting a precedent for why we should do it now. Once upon a time, first-person shooters were called Doom clones, something we abandoned when FPS became a far more valid descriptor. People are assuming this will happen with another recent term, Soulslike, currently the subgenre term for games that lift elements from the hugely influential Dark Souls series. Soulslike is almost becoming as controversial a term as Metroidvania, and perhaps will be just as criticised once we're 20 years away from Dark Souls, and critics of the age suggest it needs to be changed. I don't know, I won't be alive by then. Maybe during those years a better term will come along, or like with Roguelike and Metroidvania, it won't, and people will still be calling them Soulslikes. Personally, I think all these terms are fine, but I acknowledge they're not perfect and inexperienced people may not immediately know what they mean. But those terms won't change until something better comes along, something the majority of the community agrees is better, which happens a lot. Language evolves all the time, we're always coming up with new terms for things, retiring ones that haven't aged well, but a word change works when it's become part of the language, and an editorial that offers poor replacements for an existing term ain't gonna change the world. Besides which, is it not sometimes quicker and easier to describe something as, you know, like that? What's Ashen like? Oh, you know, like Dark Souls. What's Hard Reset like? Oh, you know, it's like Painkiller. What's Fallout 76 like? Oh, you know, like lots of wasp stings. One argument I've seen run across criticism of the term Metroidvania is that we don't call platformers Mario-likes. No, we don't, but in many ways, Mario-like is way more descriptive than platformer. People who have never heard the term platformer still know what bloody Mario is. Culturally, he's not too far behind Mickey Mouse. People know what Mario is, they know what his games are like. Mario-like works way better than platformer for people who aren't all that knowledgeable about video games, but no one clamours to replace the term platformer with Mario-like, even though, by the token of accessibility, it works better. Compared to Mario-like, platformer doesn't really say much at all. Outside of, you know, there are platforms. You can call Bloodstained a platform adventure if you want, but it doesn't really tell me what a game is like. Saying it's like Metroid or like Castlevania lets me know exactly what you mean and provides not one, but two frames of reference for anybody at any level of knowledge to look at and compare. And then there's that real knot in the issue. At this point, after almost 20 years of use, will it not be more confusing to suddenly change the term Metroidvania? The term Doom clone was abolished because it wasn't around all that long. Pretty soon, FPS became the term. That didn't happen with the Roguelike. That didn't happen with the Metroidvania. It may not happen with Soulslike. As I said earlier, when a word is used widely and for long enough, it becomes part of the language. To replace that word is not impossible. It does happen a lot, but it takes time and often effort. And is Metroidvania worth it? Probably not to 99% of people who use the word, who have a use for the word. The people for whom the term is most valuable. And when it comes to Metroidvania, even after all this time, after years of criticism, we're still at the starting line because no one's offered a superior term. So we gotta come up with a better term, get people to hear about the better term, and then undo 20 years of knowledge, experience, and use. And the thing is, for a term that describes a game that's a bit like Castlevania or Metroid, undoing 20 years of use, I'm sorry, it's just not worth the hassle. Not for that. Before we go, let's cycle back to the aesthetic argument. I was going to talk about that more in the main body, but then I focused so much on the accessibility stuff and the introduction of genres to new people and all of that stuff. But I want to circle back before I let you go about your ghastly business. I want to circle back to the aesthetic of the word Metroidvania. Awkward, clunky, they say. 5 syllables, that was one of the criticisms, 5 syllables. But in that self-same article that criticised Metroidvania for having 5 syllables, Metroidvania, they also pointed out the superiority of subgenre names such as first-person shooter or turn-based strategy. And that's fine, some people say they can be abridged, FPS, but then we cycle back again to the accessibility argument, because if you've never heard of a first-person shooter, FPS means nothing to you, and you'll waste even more time. Hey, this is an FPS. What's an FPS? First-person shooter. What's that? And then, you know, the grisly cycle continues. Sometimes words are inelegant, terms just to give you a good idea of what it is, or to have a reference point in it, for it to mean something and to describe something. Sometimes it has to be inelegant, sometimes it can't be pretty, it can't be a swishy brand name like you would see for a social media app. Not everything can be 1-syllable vowels missing, like Tinder or Grindr or Twitter. That's what they were going to call it, I bet, at one point. Turtur. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank God for me. That'll do. Yeah.